In 1940, the British Army was kicked off the beaches of northern France. Instead of trying to get back there, it spent the next 4 years fighting around the Mediterranean. British and Commonwealth forces only returned to France with American allies in 1944, while the Soviet Union bore the brunt of a life-or-death struggle with Hitler's Third Reich. Why did the British and Americans spend so much of the war paddling around the Mediterranean, around North Africa and Italy, thousands of miles from the enemy's heartland? Why was Britain's most celebrated victory of the Second World War named after a nondescript little railway station on the coast of Egypt? The campaign, in what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Hitler's Europe, takes us into some of the less familiar aspects of the Allies' Second World War. A story of a faltering empire and an army command fearful of going head-to-head against the Germans in France. A government increasingly dependent on the Americans. And a military machine whose secret weapon, the codebreakers of Bletchley Park, had dangerous flaws. The campaigns in North Africa and Italy also show us an unfamiliar side of Churchill, very different from the jaw-jutting bulldog of Britain's finest hour in 1940. A war leader who was acutely vulnerable, losing faith in his army, politically threatened at home, even ready at times to deceive his cherished American allies. The war in the Mediterranean would expose Winston's own soft underbelly. In June 1942, Winston Churchill was conferring with Franklin Roosevelt in the White House. During their meeting, a telegram was brought in. The President handed it without comment to the Prime Minister. Tobruk has surrendered, with 25,000 men taken prisoners. Churchill never forgot that moment. One of the heaviest blows, he recalled, of the whole war. Tobruk was a major port on the Libyan coast, close to the border with Egypt, and considered vital to Britain's position in North Africa. But the Germans had launched a daring surprise attack and cut the British fortress off from reinforcement. Tobruk's defences had been neglected and British morale collapsed. The commander sent a pitiful last message. Situation shambles. Am doing the worst. His garrison, actually 33,000 men, surrendered to an enemy force that turned out to be half its size. Churchill did not conceal from the President his bitter anguish. As he said, defeat is one thing, disgrace is another. The capitulation at Tobruk opened up the prospect of Germany rampaging through Egypt to the Suez Canal. And it came just a few months after the fall of Singapore, an equally humiliating British surrender, this time to the Japanese. It was less than 2 years since Churchill's finest hour, when his defiance of Hitler had inspired the Battle of Britain. How had it come to this? To understand why the surrender of Tobruk was so shattering for Churchill, we have to examine the massive challenges Britain faced in the early years of the war and go back to the hidden story of 1940.
The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war.
Churchill's rhetoric in 1940 was all about defending Great Britain and celebrating its island story. But this was for public morale at home. In reality, Churchill believed Britain's fate would be decided by events thousands of miles away. We can see this in one of the boldest decisions of 1940. Now almost totally obscured by the hype about the Battle of Britain. Churchill and his war cabinet decided to ship half Britain's tanks to another continent, to Egypt. Egypt. To us in the 21st century, that decision seems utterly crazy, because we think of Britain as an offshore European island. But back in 1940, the mindset was very different. Britain was still seen as a global power, and its leaders knew it was the empire that enabled the British to punch way above their weight in the world arena. Without the empire, Great Britain would be Little England. The supreme imperialist was Churchill himself. As a young soldier, he had defended the frontiers of empire in India, the Sudan, and South Africa. Even when Britain was faced with invasion, Churchill thought globally, not locally. In 1940, it wasn't just the British Isles that were in jeopardy, but the whole British Empire, through the Middle East and out to India. Because the empire's main artery, the Mediterranean, was in danger of being severed. As France collapsed in June 1940, Italy, Britain's upstart rival in the Mediterranean, entered the war on Germany's side.
L'ora delle decisioni irrevocabili. La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori.
For the Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, this was an electric moment. Fascist Italy posed a genuine threat to the British Empire in the Middle East. Jutting right out into the Mediterranean, it had a powerful navy and significant colonies in Libya and Abyssinia. Mussolini, strutting amid the monuments of past imperial grandeur, hoped to piggyback to glory on the shoulders of Hitler's victory over France. Mussolini reckoned that Britain's crisis would allow his army to march unopposed from Libya eastward all the way to Cairo, devouring Egypt, heartland of the once great empire of the Pharaohs, and now a vital part of the British Empire. The loss of Egypt will be the coup de grace for Great Britain, Mussolini boasted. For the British, the critical threat was to the Suez Canal, which linked Britain to the oil fields of the Persian Gulf and on to India and Australia. Supplies and men from the Empire were essential for Britain's war effort. All Britain's oil and over half its food had to be imported. Loss of the Mediterranean would add several weeks onto voyages from the Far East, exposing scarce merchant ships to attacks from the German U-boats. That's why Churchill risked reinforcing Egypt, even while Britain itself was facing imminent invasion. What looked like a dangerous British gamble proved a spectacular success. Mussolini jumped into war only to fall flat on his face. Italy's army was totally unprepared for a serious war. The British counterattacked, winning cheap and resounding victories, advancing from Egypt and driving deep into the Italian colony of Libya. But then Hitler came to Mussolini's aid. In February 1941, he sent an ace general, Erwin Rommel, to North Africa, along with good tanks and elite troops. Rommel was a leader who loved to attack and was ready to take huge risks, sometimes even against his official orders from Berlin. Under Rommel, Germany's Africa Corps started to drive the British back. During 1941, Tobruk held out, courageously defended by Australian, British and Polish troops. But in 1942, Rommel was back on the offensive. The British position in North Africa was once again in jeopardy. Britain could not afford to lose Egypt. But holding it against a formidable military machine was a massive problem, because the British Army was the weakest link in the country's war effort. The question was, could the soldiers deliver? To really grasp Britain's predicament in North Africa in 1942, we have to understand Churchill's great underlying fear: that he had an army that could not win. Britain was haunted by history. Such was the public fear of a repeat of the carnage of the Great War, the Somme and Passchendaele, that the 1914 acronym BEF, British Expeditionary Force, was banned from official documents all through the 1930s. British leaders put resources into the Air Force and Navy, not the Army, because they were sure the public would not accept another land war on the continent of Europe. They expected French soldiers would do most of the fighting in any future war against Germany. The fall of France in 1940 shredded those illusions. Now Churchill had to create a mass conscript army almost from scratch. That meant training green troops to fight battle-hardened German veterans, providing them with decent equipment, especially tanks, and finding generals who could match German commanders like Rommel. Sir Alan Brooke, Churchill's chief of the Imperial General Staff and Supremo of the Army, mused gloomily about the magnitude of the task. Half our corps and divisional commanders are totally unfit for their appointments, and yet if I were to sack them, I could find no better. The reason for this state of affairs is to be found in the losses we sustained in the last war of all our best officers, who should now be our senior commanders. Between 1940 and 1942, poorly commanded, ill-equipped and undertrained, the British Army had suffered a series of catastrophic defeats. Norway, Dunkirk, Greece, Crete, Singapore became bywords for evacuation and humiliation. Now, people joked, BEF stood for Back Every Friday. Churchill was impatient. As an ex-soldier, he knew that the only real way to train men how to fight was by fighting. And as a political leader, he understood that you couldn't sustain public morale indefinitely by big words about future success. The only place where the British were really fighting the Germans was in colonial North Africa. Britain's whole war effort had become hostage to a desert victory, and so had the fate of Britain's war leader. In 1942, Rommel was at the gates, the empire was crumbling, and the army was floundering. Worse still, Churchill's leadership was now being questioned. Discontent was brewing about his dictatorial ways and his midnight follies when he tried to impose his ideas on exhausted aides. Increasingly, even his chief advisor, Brooke, complained at having to manage what he called Churchill's impetuous nature. Twice in 6 months, Churchill had to fend off votes of no confidence in the House of Commons. Winston, MPs muttered, was yesterday's man. A titan in the crisis of 1940, but now running out of steam and lacking a vision to shape the peace. The up-and-coming men, it was whispered around Westminster, were the progressive Tory Anthony Eden, and especially the radical left-winger Stafford Cripps.
Sir Stafford Cripps signs for His Majesty's government.
Stafford Cripps was everything Churchill couldn't stand. Socialist, religious, and perhaps most horrific of all, vegetarian. But Cripps offered a radically different vision of how to win the war, which caught the public mood in those tired, fractious months of 1942.
Now over to London, where one of the biggest ever crowds assembles in Trafalgar Square for an all aid to Russia demonstration.
Cripps demanded massive aid for the Russians, whose Red Army was really taking on the Germans, unlike, it seemed, the British Army. Above all, Cripps did not share Churchill's passionate, romantic imperialism. In fact, he was demanding a firm timetable for giving independence to India.
I feel quite certain that the scheme I'm taking with me to India is one which may successfully settle for all time the future of India as a great free partner in the British Commonwealth of Nations.
Cripps posed a fundamental challenge to Churchill's view of empire. Cripps understood that if Britain claimed to be fighting for freedom, she could not hold 400 million people on the other side of the world in imperial bondage. For Churchill, the sun would never set on the British Empire. For Cripps, the twilight was already closing in. In early 1942, the idea of empire was being battered not just by politicians like Cripps, but by the subject peoples themselves, and nowhere more so than in Egypt. As in India, nationalist protests were challenging British imperial rule. But here, Rommel's Desert Army had emboldened Egypt's king and his supporters, and they were backed by crowds who thronged the streets chanting, "Down with the English" and "Long live Rommel." The British ambassador was Sir Miles Lampson, 6'5" and 18 stone, a bluff, burly figure, quite ready to throw his weight around. Lampson wanted to shore up the situation with a firmly pro-British government. But Egypt's young playboy king, Farouk, tried to defy him. So Lampson decided to show the boy, as he privately called King Farouk, just who was boss. Lampson drove down to the royal palace at the head of an armoured convoy. As British tanks and troops ringed the building, he marched in, barging aside the king's chamberlain, and gave Farouk an ultimatum: play ball or abdicate. A new pro-British government was quickly installed. This tough guy act worked, but only for the moment. Ultimately, the British Empire was a con trick, depending on prestige rather than power. There simply weren't enough soldiers and administrators to keep order if the colonial millions decided to challenge British rule. Rommel's triumphant army gave the Egyptians their cue. Only a decisive desert victory could save the British Empire. But instead of victory, what came next was that worst of all defeats: the humiliation at Tobruk. In June 1942, the Pink Telegram, thrust into Churchill's hand in the White House, summed up in a few words his anguish and that of Britain. The fragility of the empire, the failure of the army, and his own inability as a leader to deliver the victory he had promised back in 1940. On that grim morning, the only saving grace for Churchill was the generosity of his American allies. There were no recriminations. President Roosevelt simply asked, "What can we do to help?" In the bleak crisis of mid-1942, relations between Britain and America provided Churchill's only bright spot. Churchill was trying to build what he called a special relationship. The two governments were forging a uniquely close alliance. The two leaders were exchanging dozens of personal messages every week and meeting every few months. On one occasion, when Churchill was staying in the White House, Roosevelt entered his room unannounced, only to find his British guest emerging wet and glowing from the bathroom, draped only with a scanty towel. FDR started to withdraw, but Churchill beckoned him in. "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to conceal from the President of the United States." But however cosy the special relationship seemed in 1942, it was impossible to hide the nakedness of British power. Surging on from Tobruk, by August 1942, Rommel's army was only 100 miles from Cairo. Churchill blamed the retreat in North Africa on the British commander, Claude Auchinleck. In desperation, he flew out to Egypt and sacked Auchinleck and his senior staff. To head the new team, he appointed Brooke's protege, General Bernard Montgomery. Yet Monty was not entirely Churchill's cup of tea. On one occasion, Churchill visited Monty and watched some manoeuvres. Afterwards, the two men had lunch in Monty's field caravan. Monty was a lean, austere man, and the food was pretty Spartan, washed down only with water. Churchill made clear his displeasure, and Monty replied defensively, "Prime Minister, I neither smoke nor drink and am 100% fit." Churchill glowered back. "I smoke and drink and am 200% fit." But Monty had the charismatic manner and leadership skills that his predecessors lacked. He worked on basic training and made clear that there would be no more retreats.
I have ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with further withdrawal are to be burnt, and at once. We will stand and fight here. We can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead. I want to impress on everyone that the bad times are over. They are finished.
This breezy confidence was infectious, and Monty's informality endeared him to the troops. According to anecdote, as Monty's jeep was passing one British unit, a soldier wearing a top hat but otherwise completely naked doffed the hat to his commander. This was too much, even for Monty, and he issued a blunt order. "Top hats will not be worn in the 8th Army." But Monty was no Superman. In fact, he reaped the benefits of the hard work put in by Auchinleck, who had built up a force that halted Rommel's advance at the desert outpost of Alamein. Slowly and painfully, the British Army was learning how to fight. By October, Monty was ready to attack in strength, with 7 British divisions and 4 from the Empire and Commonwealth. Monty now had real superiority over Rommel, with double the troops, tanks and guns, while his enemy was starved of supplies, especially petrol.
Great point to remember is that we are going to finish with this chap Rommel once and for all.
There was one other reason for Monty's confidence. He had a new secret weapon, thanks to the work being done here at Bletchley Park, a quiet country house 50 miles north of London that had become the nerve centre of British code-breaking. The Germans used Enigma machines, like this one, to encode their messages. At first glance, it looked like a small typewriter in a wooden box, but it employed teethed wheels and telephone-style plug boards to encode messages in almost endless variety. 158 million possibilities. Penetrating the Enigma was a monumental task. It took painstaking labour, huge strokes of luck, and enormous ingenuity by the academics at Bletchley. The information generated by the codebreakers was known as Ultra. What mattered was not only decrypting and translating the signals quickly, but getting the information out to field commanders in time for it to be used in battle. In the autumn of 1942, GHQ in Cairo set up special liaison units charged with putting Ultra to good use. So Monty was the first desert general who was able to exploit Ultra. He knew the state of Rommel's dispositions. Ultra also helped the RAF to target German convoys across the Mediterranean and German air bases in North Africa, strangling Rommel's supply lines. Yet even with all the advantages of Ultra, the Battle of Alamein still had to be won by hard, bloody fighting. The battle opened on the 23rd of October with a spectacular artillery barrage, which Monty likened to a Great War 1914-18 attack. But the Afrika Korps had laid nearly 500,000 mines, so clearing a path through the minefields took time. And what Monty had envisaged as a quick tank battle turned into an infantry slogging match by British and Commonwealth forces, which for over a week seemed in the balance.
Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour. The Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat. It's known that the enemy's losses in killed and wounded have been exceptionally high.
Church bells rang out across Britain in celebration of this first victory by the British Army over the Germans. For Churchill, Alamein was redemption for the purgatory of Tobruk. Suez and the artery of empire were now secure. At last the British Army had learned how to win. At last the British people had something to celebrate. And what's more, Churchill's own political position was now confirmed for the rest of the war. For weeks beforehand, Stafford Cripps had been threatening to resign from the cabinet over Churchill's mismanagement of the war. Once Churchill gained his victory, Cripps no longer posed a threat. He did resign, but it was now a damp squib rather than a big bang. For the British public and the wider world, Churchill played up Alamein as a decisive turning point of the whole war. And that's how we tend to remember it today. But in reality, this was another piece of British spin. Talk of exceptionally high Axis casualties was an exaggeration. 2,100 Germans and Italians were killed. The British death toll was 2,300. And although more than 30,000 of the enemy were taken prisoner, Monty's caution in the pursuit allowed Rommel and much of his Afrika Korps to get away and fight another day. Contrast this with the great turning point on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, where the battle was also decided in November 1942, when the Russian pincers closed around the Germans. Around 500,000 soldiers had been killed on both sides. The Russians netted over 100,000 prisoners. Among them, 22 generals, including the supreme German commander, Friedrich Paulus. No wonder the bells also rang out from the Kremlin. Stalingrad marked the turn of the Nazi tide in the East, the beginning of a long and bloody retreat to Berlin. It also signalled the rise of a new imperial threat to the British Empire, much more significant than Mussolini's tin-pot Roman Empire. As Russia bludgeoned its way west, America was beginning to mobilise its vast resources. Both now had the power to challenge Churchill's focus on the Mediterranean. The only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. That was Churchill's lament all through the war when dealing with the Russians and even the Americans. But the hard truth was that the British Empire needed the support of allies to win the war. The problem was that this support would undermine the very empire that Churchill was fighting to protect.
The freedom we fought for in 1776, Britain has since freely given to Canada, Australia, New Zealand.
For most Americans, empire was a dirty word. They had fought a bloody war of independence to escape from the British Empire and prided themselves on not being a colonial power, unlike the nations of Europe.
Of course, no one ever talks about the British Empire today without mentioning India. And men of goodwill in Britain, as well as other countries, have been outspoken in their demands for Indian freedom. For no man who believes in democracy can support foreign rule of any people.
To Roosevelt and the Americans, Churchill embodied an archaic world order. British domination of places like Egypt and India was seen as Victorian relics that had to be swept away. US leaders were sure that they were fighting a war for high principle to spread American democratic values across the globe. The tension over empire was revealed dramatically in April 1942, when the nationalist campaign in India was reaching a crescendo. Roosevelt leaned hard on the Prime Minister to come out for Indian independence. Churchill was furious and, in effect, threatened to resign unless the President stopped interfering in what he saw as a British issue. I could not be responsible for a policy which would throw the whole subcontinent of India into utter confusion while the Japanese invader is at its gates. I should personally make no objection at all to retiring into private life. The transatlantic wrangling over empire was not only disturbing relations between the two leaders, it was also poisoning discussions between the generals over how to beat the Germans. For many American commanders, the Mediterranean campaign looked like a selfish diversion by the imperialist Brits to bolster their own power in Egypt. It also seemed a completely stupid strategy. The American Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, operated on the basis of simple geometry, insisting that since the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line, then the best route from London to Berlin was through France, via Dover to Calais.
We have our men all through the Pacific. They are landing in Ireland and in England, and they will land in France.
George Marshall was already a legend in Washington, a career Army officer renowned for honesty, candor, and organizational skill. Unlike many American generals, he had no political ambitions and didn't even vote in elections for fear of coloring his judgment. Marshall was also a match for his own president. Franklin Roosevelt was a consummate politician, charming all around him with seductive words while keeping his own counsel. FDR once remarked in a rare moment of candour, "I am a juggler. I never let my right hand know what my left hand does. And furthermore, I'm perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths if it will help win the war." Yet Marshall was never drawn into Roosevelt's political web. He deliberately kept FDR at a distance, refusing to let the president call him George, and insisting, "I want the right to say what I think, and it will often be unpleasing." Marshall was quite clear about the need for an early second front in France, and he told Roosevelt so repeatedly. In April 1942, Marshall arrived in London to present his plans for crossing the Channel, certainly in 1943 and ideally later in 1942. British commanders, mindful of the Great War, thought this was crazy. Brooke spoke scathingly about Marshall building castles in the air. But anxious not to blatantly oppose their new ally, Churchill and Brooke played a masterful game. The Prime Minister praised Marshall's momentous proposal and said he cordially agreed. He spoke expansively about complete unanimity on the framework. The two nations, he said, would march ahead together in a noble brotherhood of arms. But Churchill mentioned one broad reservation. It was, he said, essential to carry on the defence of India and the Middle East. In other words, Churchill was determined to keep on fighting in the Mediterranean. For the moment, Churchill was senior partner in the alliance. Such was America's unreadiness for war and the demands of the Pacific that the US Army could only offer a couple of divisions for any cross-channel attack in 1942. The bulk of the troops would have to be British and Canadian. This gave Churchill a veto power over what appeared in London to be a suicide mission. As a way of appeasing the Americans and the Russians, the British mounted a small-scale lightning raid on the Channel port of Dieppe in August 1942. But it turned into a complete disaster, with the Canadian 2nd Division losing 70% of its men. With this tragic vindication, Churchill managed to ward off any idea of a full-scale cross-channel attack in 1942. But he still needed to satisfy the pressure from Washington and Moscow for some kind of second front that year. If not France, then where? The strategic decisions the Allies now made would poison relations between Britain and America and fatefully shape the post-war world.